sem framfætti byggja ein.
So the other day I posted this article called Clubbing Solomon Seal, the Occult Roots of the Ægishjálmur, where I sought to debunk some of the major misconceptions about the Icelandic Galdrastafir and make people aware of a few of the rabbit holes that that surround it, that they might not have been aware of before. This is not the first time I resort to this sort of iconoclastic approach, and my polemical style would probably be well known to most of my audiences by now. It's almost a trademark of Brute Norse itself. I'm not going to get so much into detail about the article here, so if you haven't read it already, I'll link to it below. And you can regard this almost as a commentary track to the article, where I elaborate on some of the things that I said in the text, and also address some of the criticisms that I got after it. As a whole, though, I have to say that the response that I got has been surprisingly positive. I actually thought people would be more cheesed off with my irreverent style, like they were with my Valknútur article, the one where I said that the Valknútur does not exist. Kind of a hyperbole there, but that one went off like a bomb with all sorts of reactions, and as you know, you can't really change anybody's mind if they aren't really open to it, especially with an audience that is very personally invested and perhaps believe that a more nuanced approach somehow betrays their personal spirituality, or that I'm attacking their religion in some way, or whatever, If they think so, then clearly my content is not for them. Anyway, I was quite pleasantly surprised this time around, and I think that the main difference between this article and the Valknútur article is that I think I was the first person to say it back then. I think I was the first person to point at the Valknútur and the inconsistencies with it in an English language medium that was readily available. Even though I was basically just rehashing the arguments of Tom Hellers in his magnificent German dissertation on the subject, which has been sadly out of print for a number of years. And back then, I think that people were pretty shocked by these conclusions. They'd never heard about this before. I think a guy called me a nihilist for saying it. I think that's a pretty funny assessment. But this time around, I think that people were much more receptive to what I had to say. And I think that is because I was saying something that people have been thinking for a long time, and other people have drawn similar conclusions. And I probably just tapped into a vein of people who are sick of seeing the Galdrastafir sold as Viking magic. So I got a very good critical response as well from Rune Jarnø Rasmussen. He's a religious historian, and he also runs a little page called Norse Animism. I'll link to that below as well. So this video is addressed in part to him, but also to some of the more wider criticisms that I want to address, to maybe clarify what my position is on certain things. Well, anyway, Rune thought that I was being a little bit unfair in my condemnation of the Ægishjálmur when I call it a pollutive element. I think that he sees it more like, well, it's not a contrast to my perspective, I think, but he stresses, a wider religious historical continuum. And he correctly points out that there is no such thing as an objective pollution of culture. You can't really talk about that. And that the Galdrastafir are an entirely valid expression and development of Icelandic culture. And, of course, the cultures more generally develop organically and all that jazz. That's completely uncontroversial to me. But maybe that was under-communicated in my article. I could hardly agree more, though. I think that the most important point to stress here is the fact that by pollution I am not referring to the use of Galdrastafir in the wider magical discussion or spiritual traditions post-Middle Ages. That is why I use the term acculturation when referring to the development of Icelandic magic. What I'm talking about when I use the term pollution is the use of Ægishjálmur and its related symbols imposed on historical and museological contexts that they don't belong in, really, you know. And I think that criticism is totally valid. And in these contexts, I think that the Galdrastafir are textbook examples of fake lore. It would be kind of akin to talking about casinos as if this is a pre-Columbian Native American institution and not something that appeared under specific historical conditions as it actually did. And if it ain't, then nothing is. We might as well be referring to modern Scandinavians as Vikings, and of course nobody but idiots do. So this was allowed to happen, I think, because the critical reception of the Galdrastafir has been completely lacking in public discourse. The line has been somewhat blurred between historical and contemporary spiritual discussions, and both are obviously elements of the same religious timeline, but that doesn't mean that both of them belong in the same discussions. And it certainly doesn't help that the spread of Galdrastafir owes like 50% to marketing scams. It's something you just slap onto something to give it that neo-Viking rune wizard aesthetic that appeals to the Tex-Mex generation. And if that's your thing, knock yourself out. Different strokes for different folks. I argue that there is a dire need for awareness about these symbols, their historical context, and their reception. This ties directly in with my personal motivation for doing anything with Brute Norse. And if I have to boil it down to one single goal, it is to raise the quality of public discussion about the past. And part of this is my polemical style. It acts as a sort of filter, I think. And people can take it or leave it. It's not for everybody. I suspect that a lot of the problems that face the field can be traced back to branding. The show Vikings, for example, is often defended according to the reasoning that, you know, this quantity over quality line of reasoning that states that if we just bring Norse culture to the forefront of the public imagination, then we will have some sort of renaissance in terms of valuing the past. I think that, in fact, the opposite has happened. Instead of a greater variety of great and thoughtful, well-researched content and interesting ideas, there's an unprecedented abundance of shit. We can't trust marketing executives and producers to convey an accurate depiction of the past in the first place, of course, but what are they supposed to do when nuanced perspectives are so few and far between? And the public, who is just now getting familiarized with it, they don't know the difference. The proverbial children are running the school. And you can see this in the reenactment and living history scene. It used to be really awful, then it got a little better, and now there are a few who do an amazing job, and a lot of lazy bums who are doing a worse job than ever before. There are serious archaeological websites and museum shops selling Vægviser pendants superimposed on elder Futhark runes, being marketed as if this is some sort of magic Viking compass. Not only does this detract a more serious discussion of the Galdrastafir, but it damages the public understanding of Norse culture more widely. It is certainly the polar opposite of what my vision is when it comes to branding the past. And Brute Norse strives to be an outlet for people who want something else and expect a little bit more from this public discussion. And regarding my unfortunate usage of the term pollution, I would avoid this term much for the same reasons as why I dislike the discussion of abuse and misuse of symbols in the cultic milieu. But that doesn't mean that scholars or anybody else needs to accept the emic narrative. I certainly don't mean to devalue the Galdrastafir. They are a fantastic example of innovation in the Western esoteric tradition, but they're not particularly useful for understanding historical Viking Age religion. And they are not what they are being sold as. And in fact, they are being presented in a way that does more harm than good in that department. That's my whole point. I also used some examples from other magical traditions. For example, the OTO, Ordo Templi Orientis, can be regarded as an element of the whole Knights Templar and Grail mythology. But it would take a very special kind of person, I think you would agree, to study the Knights Templar in light of Aleister Crowley. That doesn't mean that Crowley's magical and initiatory system isn't part of a historical legacy. Then you have characters such as Kenneth Grant, who integrated Crowley's system with H.P. Lovecraft and flying saucers and whatnot. Obviously, this is all part of the greater tradition. That doesn't mean that the tradition isn't stratified and that we need to treat every aspect of the tradition in an equal manner. We also have controversial figures like Guido von List, who is a central historical figure in in the subject of rune magic, but not very interesting to runologists. I mean, I'm arguing from a historical perspective first and foremost, and secondly, I'm fascinated by magic from a countercultural stance, and then thirdly, I look at contemporary neo-pagan spirituality often with a very morbid sense of fascination. But I sympathize with it. I'm fascinated by the past on a deeply sentimental level, and I support any effort, I think, to use the past in the establishment of meaning. It is important to have a center, to have myths and stories and rituals that defy the mundane, everyday, rational existence. And I have gone through many different phases of this myself, down to participating in the slaughter of animals followed by a communal meal, in a very unpretentious, down-to-earth setting, by the way, that was deeply significant to me on a personal and spiritual level. That sort of primordial folk culture touched me more than any modern speculation ever could, I think. Now, I write my share of speculative, interpretational, elaborating essays for different magazines or on the blog even. I do that all the time. But I try to be very clear about what I am elaborating upon, or what is my personal take on stuff, and what is the historical meat that I'm digging into. If an organization in the Asatru community or any other neo-pagan denomination searches for existential meaning in the past, I think I can nod quite affirmingly to their mission, but that doesn't mean that I have to buy their myth of origin. I'm not here to masturbate neo-pagan theologians. Think about the Box Saga guys who sometimes stray across my blog. That's a whole neo-pagan movement based on sucking your own dick. I don't have to entertain that bogus. And I don't mean to change anybody's life philosophy here, or piss on holy ground. But if somebody gets inspired by what I do in spite of my snarky tone and sardonic humor, I'm humbled. Because at the end of the day, I'm just a nerd with a specific set of pet peeves and many axes to grind. Thank you for listening. Do what the heck thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And I ain't saying that it is your true will to support me on Patreon, but if it is, then I think you should let your holy guardian angel guide you there. Have a good night.